Good afternoon. Hello? It's not on. Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Herb Sachs, and I'm past president of the Beth Shalom Synagogue Preservation Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with the Preservation Foundation, we are a nonprofit, non-sectarian 501c3 corporation, which was established in 2007 to preserve this iconic Frank Lloyd Wright designed building, which is, as I think most of you know, is a National Historic Landmark. And our mission is to present this building, aside from conserving it and preserving it and keeping it the way that Frank Lloyd Wright designed it to the best of our ability. Our mission is also to present this building to the public and to invite the public in to see it and to learn more about it and to learn about its place in mid-20th century architecture, because it is there's a lot to be learned from walking around these halls. And for those of us that come here frequently, there's always something new to be seen. So that's what Beth Shalom Preservation Foundation is, and this is what you're going to be experiencing today is somebody. It's Harvey. Oh, it's Harvey. Oh, okay. I thought it was a baby. This is one in a series of events that the Preservation Foundation puts on to welcome the public in, and we certainly hope that you enjoy the lecture that our esteemed guest speaker will be presenting today, and we'll invite all of you to a small wine and cheese event afterwards, and that should be, I think today's event will be 45 minutes to an hour. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is Professor David Brownlee, and you'll forgive me for reading because there's too much that I couldn't memorize all of this. Professor David Brownlee is a historian of modern architecture and urbanism in Europe and America. He has taught for his entire career at the University of Pennsylvania, where he won the Outstanding Teaching Award of the College Alumni Society and the university's Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching. An important focus of his scholarship is the architecture and planning of Philadelphia. His books include architectural histories of the Barnes Foundation, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, and the Penn Campus, and the catalogs associated with exhibitions devoted to Louis Kahn, Denise Scott Brown, and Robert Venturi. He has won the major publication prizes of the Society of Architectural Historians for the USA and for its British counterpart, and the American Institute of Architects. He was named a Fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians in 2015, which in 2020 established the International Brownlee Dissertation Prize in his honor. Active in civic affairs, Professor Brownlee served for 16 years on the Philadelphia Historical Commission, and he is now on the boards of the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia, the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, the World Heritage City Project of the Global Philadelphia Association, and the Design Advocacy Group. He is a recipient of the Wick Strickland Award and the Philadelphia AIA's Paul Philippe Cray Medal. Most importantly, Professor Brownlee is the president of the Beth Shalom Synagogue Preservation Foundation, and he is much admired and appreciated by the Preservation Foundation. So without any further ado, I will present Professor Brownlee, and he will be discussing Frank Lloyd Wright. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Herb. Herb Sachs failed to note that he is the Beth Shalom Preservation Foundation, and so it's a great honor to be introduced by him. Quite seriously, I do want to encourage you to, if you've not already, join the foundation to help support the project of raising awareness of this great building and beginning to make it possible for us to secure its future. Looking ahead, I realized that in addition to wine and cheese, we do have another event in the planning stages, which is related to today's talk. On October 23rd, mark your calendars now, we're hoping to fill the driveway in front of Beth Shalom with vintage automobiles of the 1950s. A very special event to celebrate this great monument of the 1950s. In any case, I am delighted to join you today. My goal, and I realize that I can't see the screen, so I'm going to turn my computer around so I can see what happens on my computer, which should be what's happening on the screen in front of you at the same time, which we'll see how that works. Yes. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, there we go. I've forgotten that I've set that up so I can see this. My goal this afternoon is to place this building, a product of the 1950s, in the context of the 1950s, so that we can better understand its distinctive character. One important aspect of that context is the international development of 20th century architecture, in which Frank Lloyd Wright had played a seminal role, but of which he remained an ardent critic. Simply put, in the 1920s, technologically embracing abstract architectural style had crystallized in Europe. It was epitomized by the work of Walter Gropius. Seen here is his Bauhaus, the school that he founded and designed, and Le Corbusier, his Villa Savoie, a weekend house west of Paris, exemplify this style. The style came to be called the international style, and by the 1950s, it had been imported to America, where the steel and glass box had become the symbol of American corporations like Lever Brothers and manufacturers Hanover Trust, and it had also become the mainstay of big corporate architectural firms like Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, which was called SOM, the architects of these two buildings. But there were interesting developments behind this facade. In a diversifying America, new kinds of talent were finding a voice. SOM's chief designer was Gordon Bunshaft, son of Russian Jewish immigrants. And another important designer, oh, sorry, gosh, what happened there? And another important designer in the firm, did I skip it past Gordon Bunshaft? There he is, standing there with Leverhouse and Manny Hanny in New York. And another important designer in the firm was Nathalie de Blois, probably the first woman to hold such a high-profile position, although not a very visible one, it must be said, at that time. Her works included the stunning Union Carbide Tower, just demolished in land-hungry Manhattan, and the headquarters of Connecticut General, a campus-like facility in whose suburban location and whose parking lots should be remembered when we get to the next part of this discussion. But for all of the interesting behind-the-scenes social history that these buildings had, it was hard to ignore the monotonous sameness of the American corporatized international style. So formulaic was it that the New Yorker cartoonist Saul Steinberg had a field day, suggesting that the American architect had only to rip a sheet of ledger paper from a pad to have a design ready for construction. Mind you, by this date, the original international stylists, the Europeans, were already changing their tune. Frequently replacing forms inspired by technology with naturalistic shapes, like the mosque that Gropius designed for Baghdad University. It actually was built, it still stands, although in ruinous condition, and the pilgrimage chapel that Le Corbusier perched on a hillside in the foothills of the Alps, whose roof, he said, was inspired by a crab shell that he found on the beach. And Americans were not far behind in this revision of modernism. Preeminently Eero Saarinen, who never used the same shape for a building twice, and for the TWA terminal at JFK, created a gigantic sculptural bird. It's in this international context of strongly sculptural, individualistic, and often naturalistic buildings that the Mount Sinai that Wright created for Beth Shalom should be seen. Of course, for Wright, individualism and naturalism were nothing new. He was, as so often, way ahead of the game. But while it's right to see Beth Shalom and its bold silhouette in this exalted international company, I think we should also see it in the specific and a bit humbler American context of the 1960s. The automobile-born decade of booming suburbs like the Levitt towns, commercial strips like the famous Las Vegas Strip, and interstate highways. To some extent, Wright's earlier thinking, which we'll turn to in a moment, contributed to the shape of these phenomena of the 1950s. And in turn, he seems to have drawn energy from this context. Wright drove into this environment with both hands on the wheel. He loved cars, owning 85 of them in his lifetime. He loved all kinds of cars. Here, a prestigious brand new Mercedes, and on the other side, a sporty vintage British sports car. And he believed the physical shape and the spiritual character of America should be defined by the car. The suburb was an essential part of this picture. Whereas culture critics during most of our lifetimes have uniformly decried the suburb as a wasteful, uncultured sprawl, Wright saw much to value in a decentralized way of life, with every family owning its own little piece of land, here on the former potato farms of Long Island. Of course, Wright would not have liked the neo-traditionalist salt box houses that Levitt created in mass-produced uniformity. But this was not to be the defining character of the American suburb of the 1950s. By the time Levitt and Sons built their Levittown in New Jersey, shown here, alongside the salt boxes were ranch houses, inspired by Wright's well-publicized small houses of the 1930s. And the houses had garages, which he too had pioneered. And while Wright did not, and I believe could not, have claimed to have invented the split level, the variety of low-slung, multicolored, imaginatively planned houses of the 1950s American suburb certainly bore the generalized imprint of his influence. And we can certainly see that here around us in Elkins Park. However, it's necessary for us to more than quietly acknowledge that the American suburb of the 1950s was not simply the product of family aspirations and clever planning and innovative architecture. Beginning in 1937, federal policies governing mortgages steered real estate investment out of the red-lined inner cities and into the suburbs. The racism of this was literally recorded in the surveys of the red-lined districts. And indeed, the first Levittown, the one on Long Island, was for whites only. We have to own up to that. Now, if the suburban tract was where 1950s Americans lived, the Strip was where they shopped, and they shopped by car. Eye-catching, auto-oriented architecture was needed to make this work. And Los Angeles, the home turf of American car culture, is a great showcase of this type of design. Indeed, the little Googie's coffee shop on Sunset Boulevard by John Lautner in 1949, right next to Schwab's famous drugstore, Googie's lends its name to the type of roadside architecture that sells itself with a big sign and strong geometry. Googie architecture is what we call it. Now, the coffee shop was one of several types of buildings that were invented for the Strip, for the automobile shopping district. A coffee shop was, of course, a shop specially designed for those who want to drive their car to get a cup of coffee. And Chip's coffee shop, shown here, unlike Googie's, survives today and as a protected building. Filling stations were another specialized architecture of the Strip. And this swooping design, prepared in the office of the big LA firm of William Pereira, the architect of CBS's Television City, this was the work of the Chinese-born American architect Jin Wang, another of those who began in the 50s to change presumptions about the look of American architects while changing the look of American architecture. Wang was also the designer of the googiest piece of Googie architecture, which is actually called the theme building of Los Angeles International Airport. Who thought before that airports needed a theme? In any case, it was constructed as the first American commercial jetliner, the Boeing 707, was just taking to the skies. But it looks like it's headed a bit further to outer space. I'm sorry. This seems to be just at the range of my wireless remote. Also associated with the theme building was Paul Williams, who served as a consultant on the project. Williams was the first African American to join the American Institute of Architects in 1923, and we should say to be allowed to join the American Institute of Architects. And he was one of the chief contributors to the Los Angeles of Hollywood stars, cars, and architectural fantasy that provides sort of the prequel for the Googie architecture of the 1950s. Williams designed a Spanish colonial villa for the movie banker Victor Rossetti and a log cabin in the mountains for the silent film star Lon Chaney. For Jay Paley of CBS, it was Georgian Revival, as it was for the house that Judy Garland would buy when she got old enough to buy a house. The largest black-owned business in California, Golden State Mutual Life, commissioned Williams to design their headquarters building in LA, and he gave them Art Deco, that canny subversion of orthodox modernism that added decoration and pizzazz, and that seemed to foreshadow Googie architecture in important ways. And as the 50s began, Williams continued to subvert modernist tropes. His addition to the Beverly Hills Hotel was sleekly international style in overall forms, but with splashy signage, historic-looking cast-iron railings, and a starry awninged interior patio. My favorite Williams design is the Palm Springs Ranch House mansion that he created in 1954-55 for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. the stars of the long-running TV comedy I Love Lucy. Textured masonry and boldly patterned metalwork testify to the end of functionalism. While the modern open plan, long championed by Wright, is preserved and filled with sleek but unaggressive Scandinavian modern wooden furniture. A final Williams design is a piece of real Googie architecture. It's a motel, another of the specialized buildings created to serve American automobility. Williams' scallop-roofed, big-signed motel called La Conca, the Seashell, is now in a museum in Las Vegas devoted to roadside architecture. Los Angeles was not the only place to see what was really a countrywide phenomenon. In fact, Miami Beach has the biggest, flashiest examples of this exhibitionist modernism, whose greatest impresario was the Ukrainian-born Jewish architect Morris Lapidus. Lapidus famously said, "Too much is never enough." And he designed the iconic Eden Rock and Fontainebleau hotels right next to each other in North Miami Beach. The very public fight between their feuding owners has overshadowed the gigantic power of their designs, the lobby, and their skillful illusionism. In the lobby of the Fontainebleau is the famous stair to nowhere, as it was originally in black and white and today in color, which literally goes nowhere. But it provides a stage on which newlyweds and birthday celebrants can appear to be photographed and adored by their friends. Lapidus explained what he was doing in this project in a description of the entrance to the dining room in another hotel. He wrote about this: "To go into the dining room from the lobby, you walk up 3 steps, open a pair of doors, and walk down 3 steps. Now, the dining room is at exactly the same level as my lobby, but as they walk up, they reach the platform. They are on stage, as if they had been cast for the part. Everybody's looking at them, and they are looking at everybody." It's important to say that while we can smile at the silly excesses of Googie architecture, it was created by and in service to a society that was clawing its way towards a better, fairer future. In Jackson, Mississippi, the restaurant in the lusciously designed and colored Sun and Sand Motel, a block or so from the state capitol, the Sun and Sand was the chosen regular meeting place for the leaders of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. They called their strategy sessions Wednesdays in Mississippi. The Sun and Sand was demolished last year. The extraordinary, sometimes I'm bound to say almost frightening vitality of America's automobilized architecture in the 1950s was something that Frank Lloyd Wright had helped to define, as we'll see in a minute, and which energized his work until the end of his life in 1959, just before Beth Shalom opened. But he was not the only one to look with admiring interest at the suburb and the strip. Philadelphia's own Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi took their Yale students to study the strip in Las Vegas in 1968. The book, Learning from Las Vegas, was the result. In it, it either doesn't advance or it advances too. In it, they famously divided all the world of roadside Googie architecture into 2 categories: ducks and decorated sheds, distinguished by the different ways that they communicated. Ducks, inspired by the duck-shaped roadside duck meat stand at the eastern end of Long Island, ducks tell their message with sculpture. They are adorable, but not very practical as buildings. And so, for most purposes, Venturi and Scott Brown recommended decorated sheds, simple utilitarian structures that speak to passing motorists with big signs, like the casinos of Las Vegas. Less is a bore, Venturi and Scott Brown opined, contradicting the famous German modernist Mies van der Rohe, who had declared, less is more. Less well known, because it resulted in a temporary exhibition and not a book, is the study that Venturi and Scott Brown applied to suburban residential architecture. They conducted their Learning from Levittown studio at Yale in 1970. And like the Las Vegas project, it was focused on communication, the manner in which suburban architecture tells stories about the people who live in it. Venturi and Scott Brown cast loving, sympathetic eyes on the petty pretensions of suburban houses, whose modest lawns and split rail fences were meant to evoke the vast estates of landed aristocrats. So where exactly does Frank Lloyd Wright fit into this context? The first thing to say is that he loved cars. As I said, in his lifetime he earned 85 cars, big cars, small cars, luxury cars, cheap cars, new cars, classic cars, you name it. Here he is in the early 1950s with his third wife, Olga Ivana, in a vintage 1937 British AC Roadster. By this time, Wright had given up driving. When he got over 70 years old, he quit driving and Olga Ivana drove. There are accounts from the first years of the 20th century of Wright in his first car shattering the tranquility of the neighborhood of Oak Park, the Chicago suburb where he built his first house and launched his career. But it was in 1928-29 when he first went to Arizona on a prospectively lucrative project that the car bug really bit him. To cover the 1,700 miles between his home in Wisconsin, Taliesin, and what he called the Ocatilla Camp in Arizona, where he established a temporary headquarters for his staff, to make that trip he needed a big car. And he bought and proudly showed off a used 1925 Packard Phaeton, here posed in front of the camp. But grand as the Packard was, he soon learned about something much grander. The Cord automobiles that were built in Indiana, gigantic vehicles whose long, low hoods sheltered 12-cylinder engines and which had the remarkable innovation of front-wheel drive. Always alert to technological innovation, sorry. There, sorry. Always alert to technological innovation. Wright was enormously impressed by the Cord. He bought a Cord and he offered a testimonial to the builder of the car to use in his advertising. That's what you see on the right-hand side. He wrote, "A Cord front-wheel drive automobile is as nearly self-driving as a locomotive on rails." Oh, yes. Unfortunately, the car really didn't drive itself. As Wright discovered in November of 1933, when en route to an out-of-town lecture, he plowed into the side of a florist's truck that had ventured into his path. The Cord survived, but big monthly payments and difficult-to-find service led Wright to consider other options. To be sure, large luxury cars continued to hold his attention, and he bought a couple of big Lincolns before World War II stopped civilian car production. When one of his apprentices rolled one of them and demolished its roof, Wright designed a custom replacement, although it took him several years to find a body shop that would build it at a low enough price. Sleekly streamlined, it had no rear window. It was said jokingly that Wright never looked back, and it was painted his favorite dark red color, the Cherokee red that Oldsmobile had introduced in 1935, and which Wright fell in love with and subsequently used for his cars and buildings alike, as you will have noticed as you walk across the red linoleum on the way into this room. Wright also bought smaller, sportier cars. He bought an MG, a Carmen Ghia, a Jaguar, and the 11-year-old AC Roadster that I showed before. He bought it in 1948. He also bought Jeeps, a Land Rover, and smaller, cheaper cars that he imagined as the appropriate vehicle for the average American. He had a special affection for the little vehicles made by Crosley Motors of Cincinnati. He bought Crosley station wagons and trucks and several versions of the little hotshot Roadster seen here, and that's him and with Olga Vanna again in the black and white photograph. The apprentices, Wright's apprentices, hated the Crosleys, whose tiny engines were not really powerful enough for the annual pilgrimage between Wisconsin and what became Wright's permanent winter base in Arizona. Wright's dealings with automobile makers and merchants were frequent and sometimes intense. In 1954, he designed a Park Avenue showroom for the car importer Max Hoffman, and a building with a spiral ramp to show off the cars, like the ramp of the Guggenheim Museum, which was then on the drawing boards. Wright already owned a Jaguar of the kind that Hoffman sold, but he bought two Mercedes from Hoffman in 1956, a rather pompous-looking sedan at the top, and a 300 SL sports car, the car nicknamed the Gullwing because of its remarkable door hinging system that you see in the photograph at the bottom. Why all the cars? Well, I don't think there's any escaping the fact that Wright loved both speed and glamour. And he also thought of cars as part of modern life and the modern built environment, as architecture, in fact. He told an audience in 1957, "There isn't anything connected with your lives that isn't architecture. Your clothes, the way you dress, the way you live, the way you sit down and eat and what you eat. The car is architecture." And reciprocally, Wright shaped his architecture to accommodate the car. For Frederick Roby, a young executive in his family's Chicago bicycle manufacturing firm, for Roby, Wright designed one of his most famous prairie-style houses in 1908. And he gave the Roby house a 3-car garage in 1908. In 1925, he designed an extraordinary automobile project for a speculator named Gordon Strong. It was to be an automobile objective, beckoning to motorists from its Maryland hilltop and luring them to climb the mountain and then ascend the spiral ziggurat-like ramp to the rooftop viewing station. Somewhat contradictorily, underneath their feet was to be a domed planetarium. Automobiles were the essential technology of the suburb, and Wright was probably the only great artist of the suburb, and he tried to be its philosopher too. He championed a decentralized, independent way of living for the citizens of what he called Usonia, a name for the United States that he borrowed from Esperanto, although he never seems to have realized that that's where it came from. In the 1930s, he focused his attention on creating the perfect Usonian house, the perfect suburban house, what we recognize indeed as the suburban ranch house. Early in his experimentation, in 1934, he created this house for Nancy and Malcolm Willey in Minneapolis. It turns a cold shoulder at the top left and a carport, which Wright claimed to have invented, to its suburban street, while opening a wall of glass to the private garden. Inside are tiny bedrooms and an airy open space for dining and living. It cost only $10,000. But that was a lot of money. And by 1936, a cheaper construction system and a simplified plumbing plan meant that Herbert and Catherine Jacobs of Madison, Wisconsin, could build their Usonian house for $5,500. To the street, it was closed to prying eyes, save for a glimpse of the car in the carport, while the large living spaces opened broadly into the private garden. Wright wrote, "A modest house, the Usonian house, a dwelling place that has no feeling at all for the grand, except as the house extends itself in the flat parallel to the ground. It will be a companion to the horizon." Kahn proselytized about American life and the American city, or rather the replacement of the American city by an unbounded Usonian suburb. He proselytized in numerous publications, starting with a series of lectures at Princeton in 1930 that were published as the book Modern Architecture. In it, he declared that the city was a persistent form of social disease, and he bewailed the herd instinct of American city dwellers. His next fusillade was the provocatively titled Disappearing City of 1932, in which he complained that urban children grow up herded by thousands in schools built like factories, systematically turning out herd-struck morons. At this point, he began to call the new Usonian vision of land use Broadacre City. And in 1934, he set his apprentices to building a model of what he had in mind. The new city, he explained, will be nowhere, yet everywhere, Broadacre City. To pay for this project, Wright secured the support of Pittsburgh department store owner Edgar Kaufman, for whom he was just beginning to design the great Fallingwater house. Also in the photograph here is Kaufman's son, Edgar Jr., who would soon join Wright as a student. And here are Wright's apprentices in Arizona working on the huge Kaufman-funded model. That winter, they completed it under Wright's careful eyes, and in the spring of 1936, they shipped it to New York, where it was put on display in that citadel of the opposition, that monument of concentrated urban life, Rockefeller Center. It then toured the country. Today, the model is back in New York in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, where restored, it was put on display a couple of years ago. Wright continued to push his vision with two more books, the last of which, The Living City, published just before his death and just before the completion of this building, included many of the drawings that I'll share in the next couple of minutes. This diagrammatic key to the model of Broadacre City enunciates its details. There is no urban center or concentrated settlement. Public buildings for worship, for government, for education, and all kinds of recreation are scattered across the landscape, along with little farms and small industry and orchards. There are some medium and even some large houses marked on the plan, but most are to live in little Usonian houses on 1-acre lots, enough land where one could raise some of one's own food. Needless to say, the schools in Broadacre City are small schools, not the urban factories that he despised. And distance would not be measured in feet or miles. Distance would be measured in time in Broadacre City, the time needed to whisk from home to work, to church, and back. Perhaps in one's private and rather lethal-looking helicopter, as you see here, but more likely in a car. Perhaps an inexpensive descendant of the Crossley, or maybe in one of Wright's own fancifully designed three-wheeled road machines, he called them, inspired, he said, by the tractors on his family farm in Wisconsin. He complained, most American cars are designed like shoeboxes going down the highway, but a car should be designed with sleek lines like a fish in a school of fish. To minimize travel times in Broadacre City, he devoted attention to highway design, proposing an intersection system on the left that was far more economical in its use of land than the cloverleaf patterns like the one on the right with which the new interstate highway system was gobbling up the American landscape. Of course, almost all of the architecture in Broadacre City could be classified as roadside architecture, or in the terms that we're using today, the architecture of the Strip. That includes this eye-catching market about which he waxed poetic. Great, spacious roadside pleasure places, these markets, rising wide and handsome like some flexible form of pavilion, designed as places of cooperative exchange, not only of commodities, but of culture. He designed several roadside motels during this period, one of which, commissioned by the New York developer William Zeckendorf, and resembling a squadron of flying saucers, he envisioned as having a place in Broadacre City and published in his book. Theater was one of Wright's passions, and Broadacre City would have a new theater of the latest kind, with a rotating thrust stage, partly encircled by the audience. This should remind you of something that's nearby. And of course, Wright designed the prerequisite architecture of automobiling, filling stations. The one in color was designed for Tidal, Tidewater Oil Company in the 1920s, and was intended for mass production, as was the Phillips station in black and white from the 50s, which he included in the book Living City. Both would have replaced collision-prone ground-mounted pumps with hoses that would dangle from above, spewing gasoline in a way that I don't necessarily think is a lot safer. In any case, the one filling station that he actually did get to build in Minnesota was equipped with conventional pumps securely on the ground. Wright's executed projects from this period also need to be placed on the map. He surely conceived of these big projects as having a place in Broadacre City. The Johnson Wax headquarters and research tower in suburban Racine, Wisconsin, for instance, should be interpreted as the model suburban workplace, with a huge workroom in which the spirit of a big corporate family could be created. The curved, warm-colored exterior and the interior system of concrete columns in the form of lily pads seem organic, seem naturalistic. But these forms also complemented the smooth contours of the automobiles that the workers drove into their parking spots amidst the lily pads. Starting with the Chrysler Airflow in 1934, American mass-produced cars had begun to be streamlined. Government services in Broadacre City would be a drive-in affair, as Wright modeled in another flying saucer-like building, the Civic Center for Marin County, which was only completed after his death. You drive under the building to drop off your tax remittance, and who knows, maybe your ballot if they let you do that, or park nearby if you have work to do on the inside. You can see the cars in the rendering parked along the roadway in the front. The museum that Wright created for Solomon Guggenheim, a project that frequently brought him to New York during the time that he was working on Beth Shalom, that museum must also be imagined as having a place on an automobile thoroughfare in Broadacre City. In fact, Wright's first ziggurat-like design for the Guggenheim that you see on the right borrowed its form from the spiral of his automobile objective for Gordon Strong that you see on the left. As built, of course, the design was reversed, inverted, flaring out as it rose instead of in, and the spiral ramp was brought inside and put in service not of cars, but of American, that is to say, Usonian museum goers. Even on foot, he conceived of these Usonians as being perpetually in motion, able to come together only if they could somehow keep moving on a spiral ramp around a central space. In truth, it really wasn't a museum, but Wright said, a house for our people in the spirit in which our democracy was conceived. The individual integrate, that's to say, part of a group, integrate and free in an environment of his own. He also called it a plastic, humanistic space. Like the Europeans of the 1950s, and as he had throughout his own long career, Wright frequently looked for naturalistic inspiration. For the Guggenheim spiral, the spiral of a seashell met the curves of the automobile. But he also loved the angular geometry of non-organic nature, like these quartz crystals. And I'm quite sure that's what inspired the faceted man-made mountain that is Beth Shalom. It's partly naturalistic, but it's also an artifact of the American suburb, a strong roadside presence whose bold form and joyful and whose bold forms and joyful decoration beckon us up the driveway to the front door. It thus stands in good company with other American architecture of the 1950s, whether we call it Googie or not. In terms of its decoration and pizzazz, we can think of this kind of work, the Googie architecture, as finally having caught up with what Frank Lloyd Wright had been doing all along. Indeed, with its craggy silhouette, especially the two triangular ears at each end of the facade, which contain the chimneys of the fireplaces in the two lounges, this building, which was completed in 1959, even looks a little bit like the famously finned cars of the late 1950s. Indeed, we know that Old Gavanna had a 1958 Plymouth Fury like the one that's in the center on the top. But I need to put the brakes on when it comes to that kind of thinking. This is the black and white version of the painting that you see against the wall. I need to put the brakes on that. Beth Shalom was designed in the early 1950s, before finned cars. And when Wright sketched its exterior with the front drive filled with cars in 1954, in the night here and in the day here, he did not depict vehicles with preposterous, non-functional flaps that looked like the fins of fishes. He filled the driveway with cars that were sleek-bodied beauties that really looked like the fish in a school of fish that you remember he had said were the models of appropriate automobile design. In short, the cars that Wright was thinking about, I'm quite sure, were cars like his own 1953 Jaguar. Mighty, powerful, fast, but imperturbably serene. And so it should not surprise us that once Frank Lloyd Wright has attracted us to Beth Shalom and induced us to get out of our cars and come inside, the experience will not be all flash and dazzle. And he is going to serve us something more than a cup of coffee or a tank of gas. Thanks. So I'd be glad to answer any questions. Hi, yes.
Have you ever heard the reason why all of his houses and all of his public buildings, the ceilings leak?
Yes. They're not waterproof. Yeah, that's it. You know, that's it. That's it.
Because even in his own home and
Well, you know, the reason very simply is that he was perpetually experimenting on the edge of what was possible to do. I mean, he was always pushing the envelope. You probably know that he had a terribly difficult time finding a contractor who would even undertake to build this building. And that was not an experience that was unique to this structure. He ran into the same thing in building Johnson Wax and the Guggenheim. And in order to make the Usonian houses very cheap, he had to build them out of an extremely lightweight, we might even say frail wooden system. He was pushing it, he was always pushing right to the edge and a little beyond. Yes?
It's a comment rather than a question.
Oh, excellent.
Looking at Broadacre City,
Yeah.
I think you kind of get a lot of New Jersey.
Oh, yeah.
Into Broadacre.
We call that Nouvelle Gerge, those of us from there. It's kind of, you know.
And frankly, I think it's horrendous.
Yes, well, I think the truth of it is, I think that we do identify the problems of suburbia. But it challenges us to explain why it comes to exist. You know, what are the forces that created it? And part of it was this vision of a better life, of a different kind of life. I mean, and those of us who try to understand, and I think one of our goals in life should be to try to understand why things are the way they are, and that's why. There was of course enormous development pressure and economic forces that create suburbia as well, and that's indeed another important chapter. The structuring, as I said, the structuring of the mortgage system that made it possible to build in suburbia and not possible to build in lower North Philadelphia was certainly a large part of it. But it wasn't just economics, and although racism was a part of it, it wasn't just racism. It was this vision that a real America was an America where everyone had their own plot of land, and they, if they wanted to see someone, or they'd get in their car. But I would say one other thing that I think is really important is there really is a conceptual shift that is created by technology, that distance is no longer how long it takes you to walk there. This distance is not measured in your footfalls, but in the rapid turning of a rubber tire. And it changes, that really does change one's conception of the world. Other questions or comments? Okay, we can have wine and cheese. Thank you very much.
driving,
Yeah.
how in Florida, how the roads are so much wider. You know, they learned from these, but I don't know how, right. Right, in Florida, it's just overbuilt, one community after another. And they're trying to take over our agricultural land and everything else, and
Yeah, you know, at a certain level, you know, Wright
Yeah, they go up in that upstairs, right behind that room.